He thought he was about to fire someone, but instead he found the most dedicated worker he'd ever met, and the heartbreaking reason behind it. Richard Hulston always said he could walk into any restaurant he owned and tell within 5 minutes whether things were headed downhill. But standing outside Harvest Lane Bistro in Columbus, Ohio at nearly 11 at night, he wasn't so sure anymore. The place wasn't failing yet, but it was slipping. Slow nights, low morale, too many complaints about wait times. It didn't feel like the kind of place he'd spent half his life building. He pulled the hood of his gray sweatshirt over his head and adjusted the fake beard the production team insisted he wear. He hated the thing. It scratched like steel wool and made him look like someone trying too hard to disguise himself. But he wasn't here to look comfortable. He was here to figure out why one of his most promising locations couldn't stay on its feet. When he stepped inside, the air still carried a sweetness from the earlier dinner rush, a mix of roasted garlic, lemon butter, and something smoky he recognized from one of their signature dishes. The dining room lights were turned low, and chairs were flipped onto tables. Only one bulb above the bar still glowed, a pale reminder that the day had been long. Richard exhaled slowly. "All right," he whispered to himself. "Let's see what's going on in here." This wasn't his first undercover shift. He'd done this almost a dozen times over the years, each time hoping to quietly spot the real issues without scaring anyone into pretending everything was perfect. But tonight felt different, and he couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the time, maybe it was the silence, maybe it was that nagging suspicion that something bigger was happening behind these walls. He headed through the empty dining room and pushed open the swinging door to the kitchen. The stainless steel counters were wiped, but not spotless, like whoever cleaned was trying to get out quickly. A row of cutting boards leaned against the wall. Someone had left a half-full container of chopped cilantro on the prep table. Richard made a mental note, sloppy clothes. He checked the clipboard, hanging beside the walk-in freezer. The closing checklist had 3 signatures from earlier in the evening. Everything looked normal, too normal. Honestly, that was usually a bad sign. When people checked boxes too neatly, it meant they were trying to cover something. He walked deeper into the kitchen and paused, listening. At first, nothing, not even the rolling sound of carts from the back hallway. Then, a soft tap, slow, steady, repeating in the same pattern. Tap, tap, tap. He tilted his head. It sounded like a knife hitting a cutting board. But no one was supposed to be here this late. Only the manager locked up and left. Richard double-checked his watch. It was 3 minutes past 11. Tap, tap, tap. There it was again, a rhythm, careful, controlled, almost like someone didn't want to be heard. He followed the sound past the dish station, past the stock shelves, and toward the prep room in the back corner. "Hello?" he called out, keeping his voice as average and unassuming as he could. "Someone here?" No answer, but the tapping continued. He moved closer, grip tightening slightly on his phone in his pocket. He wasn't scared, not exactly, but he was alert. He pushed open the door to the prep room, just a few inches. That's when he saw it. A single overhead light was on, and standing under it with his back half turned was a young man with deep brown skin, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the vegetables he was chopping. His movements were sharp, quick, and weirdly quiet for someone using a chef's knife. Richard blinked. He recognized him from the employee files. Darius Cololton, prep cook. 23 years old, hired 6 months ago. Shifts mostly evenings. Why on earth was he here at 3 o'clock in the morning? Richard stepped fully into the doorway. "Hey," he said, "didn't mean to startle you. You're here late." Darius flinched just a little, then relaxed his shoulders. Yeah, sorry. Just catching up on some stuff." Richard watched him for a moment. The chopping never stopped. "Mind if I ask what stuff?" Darius hesitated just for a breath. "Prep work. I don't like leaving too much for the morning crew." Richard noted the way he said it. Not annoyed, not proud, more like defensive. Like if he didn't get the answer right, there would be consequences. Richard offered a small smile beneath the itchy fake beard. "I'm new. They've got me training on nights. Name's Mark." Darius glanced at him briefly. His eyes were tired in a way that didn't come from a long shift, but from something much heavier. "Nice to meet you," he said. "I'm Darius." Richard nodded toward the cutting board. "You always do prep this late." There was that hesitation again. Tiny but obvious. Darius looked down at the vegetables. Just sometimes Richard didn't push. Not yet. He just gave a light nod and leaned against the wall, pretending to look curious rather than suspicious. He didn't know it yet, but this simple question, this tiny moment, would crack open everything he thought he knew about his own business. But something in Darius's tone made Richard stay in that room a little longer. as if the real story was hiding behind every quiet slice of that knife. Richard hadn't planned on sticking around longer than a few minutes, but once he saw Darius chopping away like the next day depended on it. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to stay right there. He stepped far, there into the prep room, pretending to look around like a clueless new hire, but really, he was studying every detail he could. The room had that sharp kitchen smell of cut onions mixed with cold metal. A single radio sat on the back counter, turned low enough that Richard couldn't make out the song. Plastic containers were stacked to the side, ready for storage, and a thin layer of carrot shavings dotted the floor near Darius's feet. That alone told Richard the guy had been here for hours. Darius sliced through red peppers with smooth, almost mechanical motions, not sloppy, not rushed, just controlled like he'd done it so much that his brain didn't have to be involved anymore. Richard cleared his throat. So, who usually closes around here? I wasn't sure where to clock out. Darius didn't look up. Mason usually does. He left earlier. He wasn't feeling too great. Richard raised an eyebrow. That didn't match the logs he'd seen. Still, he kept his voice casual. You didn't feel like heading out with him. This time Darius paused just for half a second. It was quick, but Richard caught it. I had a little more to finish. Richard nodded slowly. Looks like more than a little. Darius didn't respond. He just moved on to chopping celery. But his movements weren't as steady as before. His fingers shook slightly. His eyelids drooped. He wasn't just tired. He looked worn down in a way that hit Richard harder than he expected. He stepped closer. Hey, how long you been here today? Darius took a moment to answer. Came in around 5. Richard glanced at the wall clock. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah, so, you've been here 10 hours already? 12, Darius corrected quietly. I started early, 12 hours, Richard repeated almost under his breath. And you're still going? Darius gave a small shrug. Just keeping up. Richard almost slid into CEO mode right then. Questions, protocols, labor laws, but he stopped himself. He wasn't here as the boss. He was Mark, the awkward new guy with zero authority. So, he tried a softer approach. Look, man, nobody else is here. You don't have to stay for my sake. If you're tired, you can chill. No one's checking. Darius shook his head. It's fine, it doesn't look fine. That made Darius freeze. His knife hung in midair for a moment before he resumed chopping. I'm good, he muttered, but Richard didn't buy that for a second. He studied him more closely. The dark circles under his eyes, the worn-out shoes, the faded apron tied twice around the waist because the straps were fraying. This was someone running on fumes. So, you live nearby? Richard asked. About 15 minutes from here. Walk? Bus? Richard leaned against the counter across from him. You always work nights mostly. You like it? Darius let out a short breath that could have been a laugh, but wasn't. It's quiet. A quiet kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning wasn't normal, and it wasn't peaceful. Either, it was lonely, desperate. Richard recognized that kind of quiet. You only chose it when the alternative was worse. Before he could ask anything else, Darius finally looked up at him. His eyes were darker than before, almost hollow. Why are you here so late? He asked at Richard. Shrugged. I'm training. Manager said I should learn night shifts first. Darius didn't question it, but he watched Richard for a long moment, like he was trying to figure something out. Then he nodded and went back to slicing. Richard stepped closer to the prep table. Mind if I help? Help with this? Darius asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, Richard said with a small smile. How hard can it be? Darius almost smirked. You ever cut peppers before? Once, maybe twice. Didn't go great. A tiny laugh escaped Darius, the first sign of life Richard had seen from him so far. He handed Richard a spare knife. Just don't cut your fingers. We don't want blood on the menu. Richard chuckled and took the knife. They stood side by side, chopping an uneven rhythm. Darius fast and precise, Richard painfully slow, but it loosened the air between them. After a couple minutes, Darius glanced at him. You're holding the knife wrong. Yeah, Richard said. Show me. Darius guided his hand briefly, adjusting his grip until it was stable. His touch was gentle but tired, like even that small motion took effort. What about you? Richard asked quietly. What's keeping you here this late? Darius stiffened instantly. I told you, just catching up. Richard nodded, but he could tell that was only the surface. Maybe not even that. Something else was hiding underneath. Something personal. But before Richard could push any further, the back door made a sound, just enough to make both of them lift their heads. The sound from the back hallway wasn't loud, but it was enough to make both men turn their heads at the same time. Something scraped lightly across the tile floor, like a small box being dragged. Richard straightened a little. Darius, though. He went still in a way that made Richard pay attention. Not scared, not startled, more like bracing for something he already expected. Richard waited for him to say something he already expected. Richard waited for him to say something. Maybe explain the noise, but Darius just swallowed hard and kept chopping again, quicker this time, like the knife was a shield. "You okay?" Richard asked quietly. "Yeah, just the wind," Darius said. "There's no wind inside a building," Richard replied, raising an eyebrow. Darius didn't answer. He just cut faster. Richard wiped his palms against his apron. "Want me to check it out?" "No," Darius said sharply, then softer. "Sorry, it's not a big deal." That told Richard everything. It was absolutely a big deal. He leaned on the prep table, trying again. "Hey, if you're worried someone came in, I can go look. I'm bigger than I look." Darius glanced at him, eyed his thin frame under the hoodie, then muttered, "I doubt that." Richard laughed gently. "All right, fair, but still." Before he could finish, the scraping sound happened again. This time it was closer. Just a few yards down the hall, Richard stepped forward an inch. "Seriously, man, that's not nothing." Darius closed his eyes for a second. "It's fine, it's not dangerous." Richard waited. "It's my sister," he finally said. Richard blinked. "Your sister here?" Darius nodded once. "She's 10. She's in the storage room." Richard didn't try to hide how surprised he was. "What? Why?" "It's 3 o'clock in the morning." Darius set his knife down gently, like his hands were suddenly too heavy. "Because I couldn't leave her alone tonight." That answer sat between them for a moment, heavier than anything in the room. Richard felt something twist inside him. Not pity, not confusion, but something close to both. "Can I meet her?" Richard asked carefully. Darius shook his head. "She's sleeping. She had a rough night." Richard hesitated. If this really was the only safe place the kid had right now, then that explained a lot. But it also opened 100 questions he couldn't ask yet without blowing his cover, so he softened his tone. "You sure she's all right?" "Yeah," Darius said, but it didn't sound confident. "She gets anxious a lot. I didn't want to leave her home alone. I don't usually bring her, but I didn't have anyone else." Richard nodded slowly. "Must be hard." Darius shrugged. "You do what you got to do." The simplicity of that answer hit Richard harder than any dramatic confession could have. He'd heard cooks complain about scheduling, pay rates, equipment, everything under the sun, but Darius spoke like someone who didn't have the luxury of complaining. Richard set his knife down and leaned on the counter. "You always work this law." "Tea?" "Yeah, because of her." Darius didn't reply. Richard tried again. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Darius let out a breath that sounded like defeat. "I sleep when I can." That was when Richard noticed the small container of cut fruit near Darius's station. Grapes, apple slices, little pieces of banana. Not restaurant prep. Not part of any dish on the menu. Food for a kid. Done quickly, likely hours ago. "Hey," Richard said softly. "I don't want to pry. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." Darius ran a hand over his forehead. "I know, but if there's something you need, nothing anyone here can fix," Darius said. He didn't sound rude, just tired. Deeply tired. Richard studied him, then looked around the kitchen. The empty space, the lonely hum of the freezer. The feeling that this place wasn't just where Darius worked, it was where he hid. "Listen," Richard said, lowering his voice. "Why don't you take a little break? I'll keep chopping so you don't fall behind." Darius gave a small shake of his head. "No, if I stop, I'll crash." Richard could believe that. He picked up the knife again, trying to match Darius's rhythm. "So you cook at home too, or just here?" "Home," Darius answered quietly. "Been doing that forever for you and your sister." "And my mom," he said, just barely above a whisper. "Jan," Richard started, then stopped himself. He didn't know the situation, and asking directly might shut the conversation down, so instead he asked something gentler. "She's still around?" Darius didn't speak, not right away. He chopped slower, then stopped altogether. "No," he said finally, "not for a while." Richard held his breath. This wasn't the kind of conversation people had with strangers. It especially wasn't the kind people volunteered at 3 o'clock in the morning unless they were stretched thin enough to crack. He was about to say something simple, something G-human when the door near the hallway clicked softly. Darius turned instantly. Richard saw it. Then the slight panic in his eyes, the quick breath he took. Whoever was behind that door mattered, but before either of them said a word, the knob started turning and Richard braced himself, knowing this night was about to shift into something much bigger. The doorknob turned just a crack before stopping, like whoever was on the other side was still deciding whether to enter. Richard stepped back, not wanting to look intimidating, and Darius walked toward the hallway with a quickness that didn't match how tired he'd been moments before. "It's okay," he called softly. "It's just me." The door unlatched the rest of the way and a small face peeked through the opening. A girl with tight curls pulled into a loose ponytail. She rubbed one eye with the back of her hand. "Did you call me?" She whispered. "No, Lonnie," Darius said gently. "Go back to sleep. I'll be done soon." The girl looked past him at Richard. Her eyes widened slightly, not scared, but curious. Richard lifted a hand in a small wave. She didn't wave back, but she didn't hide either. She rested her head against the doorframe like she was too tired to stand straight. "Who's that?" she whispered. "He's new," Darius said. He whispered. "He's new," Darius said. "He's just helping." Richard offered a soft smile. "Hi, Lonnie, I'm Mark." She nodded once, slow, then turned to her brother. "I'm cold." Darius closed his eyes briefly, not annoyed, not frustrated, just overwhelmed. "I know. I'll grab your jacket." He slipped into the hallway with her, leaving Richard alone in the prep room. The silence settled immediately, thicker now that he'd seen the weight. Darius carried a 10-year-old kid asleep in a restaurant storage room at 3 o'clock in the morning, a brother chopping vegetables until his hands shook. Something was off, far more off than what Richard had expected. Ted defined when he came undercover. A couple of minutes later, Darius walked back in. Lonnie wasn't with him this time. He'd wrapped something around his hand while he was gone, an old dish towel tied tight across his palm. "You cut yourself?" Richard asked. "No," Darius answered quickly. "Just a blister." Richard didn't push, but he noticed the towel was already spotting with red. Darius returned to the cutting board, moving with that same robotic precision he'd used earlier, but there was a difference now. His shoulder looked heavier. His movements didn't have the same smooth flow. "You sure you don't want to take a break?" Richard said. "You've got a lot going on." Darius shrugged. "Breaks slow me down." Richard picked up another pepper. "You must really care about this job." "It's a job," Darius said. "I show up, that's all." "That's not all," Richard replied. "Most people wouldn't be here this late if they had a choice." Darius hesitated. "Most people don't need to." Richard felt that, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The only sound was the clacking of knives against the boards, uneven but steady. So Richard said quietly, "You said your sister gets anxious." Darius nodded. "Yeah, she go to school around here." "Lincoln Elementary," he answered. "That's a good school," Richard said. "Yeah," Darius replied. "They've been good to her." He didn't say me. Richard caught that too. After a brief pause, Richard tried a different angle. "So, how long have you been taking care of her like this?" A muscle in Darius's jaw twitched. "A while since your mom." Darius cut him off gently. "Let's not go there." Richard raised his hand slightly. "Fair enough." He didn't push further. Not yet. This wasn't the moment to pry open wounds. It was the moment to listen. Darius continued, slicing in silence for a minute, then surprised Richard by speaking first. "You ever take care of ass?" "Omen, like full-time." Richard blinked. "Not really. I mean, I helped with my parents when they got older. But nothing long-term." "It's different," Darius said. "It's like every hour matters. Every decision matters. You mess up once, it hits them harder than it hits you." Richard nodded slowly. "Sounds like a lot for one person." "It is," Darius said, "but I don't get to complain." "Why not?" "Because it's not her fault." Those 5 words hit Richard harder than he expected. Because it's not her fault. Something in Darius's voice, calm, tired, matter-of-fact, told Richard everything he needed to know. This wasn't obligation. This wasn't resentment. This wasn't resentment. This was someone carrying the world because he refused to let a child suffer it alone. "You must be a good brother," Richard said. Darius didn't smile. "I try." Richard studied him quietly. The slump in his shoulders, the towel wrapped around his hand, the exhaustion in his eyes. This wasn't just a kid working hard. This was someone fighting battles he didn't have the luxury to talk about. "So," Richard said carefully, "do the managers know she's here?" Darius shook his head. "No. What would happen if they found out?" Darius didn't answer right away, but he didn't need to. The silence said, "Enough." After a moment he looked at Richard. "Look, can you not say anything? I don't want to get fired. We need this place." Richard held his gaze. "I'm not going to say anything." Relief washed across Darius's face. Quick but real. He exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping an inch. "Thanks," he murmured. Richard nodded. No problem, and in that moment everything changed. Darius didn't know who he was talking to. He didn't know the man beside him could decide his future in a heartbeat, but he trusted him anyway, just enough to ask for one small favor. But Richard could tell this wasn't the whole story. Not even close. Something deeper was going on. Something big enough to force a young man into this kind of life. The kitchen felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because Richard finally understood the weight hanging over the room. Every chopped pepper, every shaky breath from Darius, every quiet glance down the hallway. It all carried meaning he hadn't seen before. Darius tried to get back into a rhythm, but it wasn't happening. His cuts grew uneven. Twice the knife slipped and skimmed dangerously close to his fingers. Richard stepped in without thinking. "Hey, slow down," he said. "You're going to cut yourself." "I'm fine," Darius muttered. "You're not," Richard replied gently. Darius set the knife down and wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. The dish towel around his hand shifted, revealing more red than before. Richard pointed to it. "That's not just a blister." Darius tucked the towel tighter. I said, "It's fine." "Yeah, well, saying it doesn't make it true." Darius looked at him, then really looked, not with anger, not with annoyance, but with the expression of someone who'd run out of excuses and didn't know what else to say. He swallowed. "It's been a long week. Looks like it's been a long year," Richard said softly. Darius gave a small, humorless laugh. Something like that. He sank onto a stool by the prep table and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. For the first time since Richard walked in that night, he wasn't trying to push through. He wasn't pretending to be okay. He was just sitting there worn down to the bone. "You eat today?" Richard asked. Darius shrugged. "Had a sandwich earlier." "When?" Around noon." Richard blinked. "You haven't eaten in 15 hours, Darius didn't answer. "You're going to pass out at this rate." "I don't have time to pass out," Darius said. He said it calmly, like it was just another fact of his life. Richard grabbed a small take-home container from the shelf and filled it with chopped chicken from the cooling rack. "Here, eat." Darius stared at it but didn't reach for it. "I can't. That's for tomorrow's shift." "This isn't a test," Richard said. "Just eat." Darius looked torn, like taking that food was somehow selfish. But after a moment hunger won. He took the container and ate a piece of chicken slowly, almost cautiously, as if he wasn't used to anyone handing him something without expecting something back. After a few bites he whispered, "Thanks." Richard leaned against the counter. "Does she eat your sister?" Darius nodded. "Yeah, I always make sure she does. What about you?" Darius looked at the container in his hands. "I get by." It was the kind of answer that sounded simple but carried a lot of pain behind it. "Does the school know what's going on at home?" Richard asked. "No," Darius said quietly. "Why not?" "Because they'd call someone, and if someone gets called, they'll split us up." That sentence sank into the air between them. Heavy, raw, real. Richard felt a pressure in his chest. "Is that what you're scared of?" "It's not a fear," Darius said. "It's a fact. Once they get involved, it's done. She goes into a program. I lose her. You're her only family." "I'm the only one who stayed," Darius said. He didn't sound angry, just honest. Richard watched him take another small bite of chicken. His hand trembled as he lifted it. Not from fear, but exhaustion. "You know," Richard had said, "most people your age are barely figuring things out. You're raising a kid while working 12 3-hour shifts. I didn't have a choice." "What happened?" Richard asked softly. "To make you step in like that?" Darius didn't answer immediately. He stared at the prep table, eyes unfocused, like he was staring back into something he didn't want to revisit. "My mom got sick," he said finally. "What kind of sick?" "The kind that doesn't get better." Richard nodded, slowly. "You were taking care of her, too." "Yeah," Darius said. "Between school and whatever jobs I could get, I tried to keep up with everything. But when she got worse, I started missing classes. Teachers talked to me, counselors. Teachers talked to me, counselors. They all said the same thing. College would still be there later. Family came first. And they were right." Richard said maybe. Darius replied. "But after she passed, I didn't have time to think about college anymore. I had a kid to look after." He rubbed his face with both hands. "So I started working wherever I could. Dish pits, stock rooms, cafes. This place is the first real kitchen that actually gave me a chance to learn stuff." Richard let that sit for a moment. "You're good," he said. "I mean that. I can tell." "Doesn't matter if I'm good," Darius said. "I don't have the papers, no diploma, no fancy school. Nothing that proves I belong in a kitchen." Richard folded his arms. You think talent only counts when someone prints it on a certificate. No, Darius said, but the world does. Richard felt his jaw tighten, not with frustration at Darius, but at the system that forced him to think that way. You ever think about getting certified? Richard asked. Yeah, Darius said. But those programs cost money and time. I don't have either. Maybe someday, Richard said. Someday isn't soon enough, Darius whispered. Silence settled again, and Darius looked down at his bandaged hand. His shoulders sank even lower. Richard stepped closer. Look, you're doing everything you can. Sometimes, Darius said. It doesn't feel like enough for her, Richard asked. For anything, Darius admitted. Feels like I'm always one bad week away from everything crashing. Richard swallowed. Does anyone help? Anyone at all? Darius shook his head. No one. Richard exhaled slowly. Small pieces of the truth were falling into place, but he could tell there was something even big, something Darius hadn't said yet. But before Richard could ask, a loud thud echoed from the hallway, making Darius jump to his feet like a spark had hit him. Because whatever caused that sound wasn't normal for a restaurant at 3 o'clock in the morning. The thud wasn't small this time. It was sharp, heavy, like something or someone had fallen. Darius bolted toward the hallway before Richard could say a word. Richard followed, not running, but close behind, ready to step in if needed. They reached the storage room and Darius pushed the door open. Inside, little Lonnie was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled tight to her chest. A metal bin lay on its side beside her. She must have knocked it over when she tried to stand. Hey, Darius said, dropping to his knees. You okay? Lonnie nodded, but tears filled her eyes anyway. I had a nightmare. Darius pulled her into his chest instantly. You're safe. I'm right here. Richard stayed by the door, giving them space. It wasn't his place to step in, not yet. But watching the way Darius held her, the way her tiny hands clung to his shirt like he was the only stable thing in her world made something in Richard's chest tighten. After a minute, Darius stood up with her still holding on. Let's go back inside, he whispered. You shouldn't be on the floor, okay? She nodded and buried her face in his shoulder. When they returned to the prep room, Darius settled her on the stool he'd been sitting on earlier. She pulled her jacket tighter and looked around the room with sleepy eyes. You want water? Darius asked her. She nodded again. He grabbed a small cup, filled it at the sink, and handed it to her. Lonnie took a sip, then noticed Richard again. Why is he still here? She asked softly. Richard stepped forward just enough to seem friendly. I'm helping your brother with the veggies. I'm slow, but I'm trying. Lonnie gave a sigh. Nice smile. Darius almost smiled too, but it faded quickly. He looked at Richard with an expression that said he knew things couldn't stay like this. He knew the questions were coming, and Richard didn't want to waste the moment. He leaned against the counter, lowering his voice. Darius, earlier you said you're always one bad week away from everything crashing. What did you mean? Darius didn't answer immediately. He watched Lonnie finish her water, her small legs swinging, while she hummed quietly under her breath. Finally, he spoke. When my mom got sick, she couldn't work anymore. Bills piled up. I tried. I took whatever jobs I could, but I was 16. No one pays a kid enough to run a whole apartment. Richard listened closely. We got help for a while. Neighbors, church, people who meant well. But after she passed, everyone disappeared. Not because they didn't care, just because their own lives kept going. He rubbed the back of his neck. I was 17 when they told me they might take Lonnie. Said I was too young. No income, no plan. What did you do? Richard asked. I lied. Darius said simply. Told them my uncle was moving in. Told them we had savings. Told them my uncle was moving in. Told them we had savings. Told them I had said simply. 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 Told them everything they needed to hear, and they believed you barely. They said they'd check in. I made sure they didn't have a reason to come back. Richard nodded slowly. And school. I tried, Darius said. But between 2 jobs and taking care of her, something had to give. So you left. Yay, he said. I left. He didn't say it with shame. He said it like someone who made a choice. One he'd make again if he had to. And since then, Richard asked, it's just been keeping up rent, food, clothes for her, bus passes, making sure she gets where she needs to go. I work late so I can take her to school in the mornings. I pick up shifts when people quit or call out. I save every penny I can." Richard looked at the towel around his hand. "And there. Two, at injury." Darius hesitated. Then he exhaled. "I burned it yesterday. Oil splash. Didn't have time to get it checked." "You didn't go to urgent care." He shook his head. "Cost too much. I need the money for rent." Richard swallowed hard. He wasn't used to staying quiet, but this hit him so deeply that the words just stayed locked in his chest. Darius sat beside Lonnie, resting a hand on her back as she leaned into him. "She had a panic attack tonight," he said. "Bad one. She gets scared sometimes when it happens. She doesn't want to be alone. I couldn't stay home and miss the shift, so I brought her." Richard stared at the kid he thought was just a dedicated employee. Now he saw something he never expected. A young man holding up his world with shaking hands, refusing to let it collapse. "You shouldn't have to carry all this by yourself," Richard said quietly. Darius shrugged. "Who else is going to do it?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Lonnie tugged on her brother's sleeve. "Can we go home yet?" she whispered. "Almost," he said gently. "Let me finish the peppers." She nodded and rested her head against his arm. Richard stepped forward. "Let me finish them." Darius blinked. "You don't have to. I want to." Darius studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded and handed him the knife. As Richard chopped slowly but steadily, he kept watching the two of them. Lonnie's tired eyes, the way she gripped the sleeve of his apron, the way Darius pulled her close as if at any second she might slip away. When Richard finished the last pepper, he turned to Darius. "You know, you're not alone, even if it feels like it." Darius looked down. "Sometimes it feels like I'm failing her." "You're not," Richard said firmly. "You're doing more than most grown adults would ever do." Darius didn't answer, but the way his shoulders loosened told Richard those words mattered. He wiped the cutting, bored clean, and stepped back. "Darius," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Darius looked up, confused. "What's up?" Richard hesitated, not because he was unsure, but because he knew what came next would change everything. "Who I am isn't exactly who I told you." Darius stiffened. "What do you mean?" Richard inhaled slowly, but before he could reveal the truth, the front door of the restaurant opened, and footsteps echoed across the empty dining room, heading straight toward the kitchen. Both Richard and Darius froze as the footsteps got closer, heavy, definite, not the kind of steps someone takes when they're lost. Whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. Lonnie tightened her grip on her brother's sleeve, her eyes darting toward the doorway. Darius whispered, "Stay here," and moved instinctively in front of her. Richard stepped forward too, not to shield anyone, but because he suddenly felt responsible for everything in that room. This was his restaurant, his people, his responsibility, even if no one knew it yet. The kitchen door swung open and a tall man stepped inside, dark jacket, clipboard under his arm, keys dangling from one hand. It was Mason, the shift manager. He stopped mid-step when he saw them. His eyes flicked from Richard to Darius, then to Lonnie on the stool. "What's going on here?" he asked, voice sharp. Darius tensed. She couldn't stay home alone." "That's not what I asked," Mason cut in. "Why are you two still in the building at this hour? And who is this guy?" Richard kept his posture neutral. "I'm Mark New. They had me training on nights. We don't have any new hires on nights," Mason replied. Richard knew that tone. It wasn't anger. It was a man sensing trouble and wanting to shut it down fast. He could almost admire it if it didn't land squarely on the wrong person. Darius stepped forward. "Mason, look, I just needed a place." For her to calm down. She wasn't feeling good. "I wasn't trying to break any rules." Mason rubbed his forehead. "Darius, you know this is not allowed. If corporate finds out, I know." Darius whispered. Lonnie pressed closer to him. Richard saw the fear in her eyes and something in him snapped. He'd watched enough. He'd heard enough. He'd heard enough. He'd seen enough. This kid had been apologizing to the world long before Mason ever walked into this kitchen. Richard stepped between them. "Mason," he said evenly, "I think we should slow down a bit." Mason scoffed. "Slow down? Who are you to tell me to slow down? This is a liability nightmare." Richard pulled off the hood, then he peeled off the fake beard. Mason's eyes went wide. No way, Mr. Holston." Darius's face dropped. Lonnie blinked up, confused. Richard nodded. "Yeah, it's me." Mason straightened so quickly he almost dropped the keys. "Sir, if I'd known." "That's the point," Richard said. "You weren't supposed to know." He turned to Darius, whose expression had shifted from exhaustion to panic. I didn't know," Darius stammered. "I'm sorry." I wasn't trying to do anything wrong. I just stopped, Richard said gently. You don't need to apologize to me. Darius swallowed hard. But she's not supposed to be here and I'm not supposed to be working this late. I know that. I just didn't have another option. I know, Richard said. That's why I'm here. Darius looked at him confused. What do you mean? Richard motioned for Mason to step aside. Then he pulled up the second stool so he could sit in front of Darius and Lonnie like a parent talking to a child who'd been unfairly cornered. Listen, Richard said softly. Tonight wasn't about rules. Tonight was about seeing what's really going on in this place. And what I saw wasn't someone breaking policy. I saw someone carrying way too much on his shoulders. Darius lowered his eyes. I'm doing the best I can. I know you are, Richard said. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. Mason lingered nearby like he wasn't sure whether to speak or leave. Richard waved him off. It's fine. I got this. Mason nodded quickly and stepped outside the prep room, closing the door behind him. Richard turned back to Darius. You weren't supposed to find out this way. I was going to tell you earlier before Mason walked in. But yes, I'm undercover. And yes, I own this restaurant. Darius looked stunned. Why? Why were you helping me chop vegetables? Because I wanted to see how you really work, Richard answered. And because you looked like you needed someone standing next to you, Darius let out a shaky breath. I don't want you to think I'm using this place like a shelter. I wasn't trying to take advantage of anything. I don't think that, Richard said firmly. I think you're trying to survive, and that's not the same thing. Lonnie leaned against her brother, still tired, but listening. Richard softened his voice. Darius, why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you say you were struggling? Because people judge you when you say stuff like that, Darius said. They think you're irresponsible or unstable or a risk, and if they think that… He paused, voice cracking. They take her. Richard nodded slowly. You've been protecting her, all I've ever done, Darius said. For the first time, Richard saw tears in his eyes, not from weakness, but from carrying something alone for too long. Richard leaned forward. You're not losing your job. Darius blinked. What? You heard me? Richard repeated. You're not losing your job. You're not in trouble either. But you're doing everything you can, and it's time someone helped you for a change. Darius stared at him, unsure whether to believe it. Lonnie looked up. Are we going to get kicked out? She whispered. Richard's chest tightened. No, sweetheart. Richard's chest tightened. No, sweetheart. You're safe, I promise. Her small shoulders relaxed a little. Darius covered his face with both hands, overwhelmed. I never wanted anyone to see us like this. I'm glad I did, Richard said, 'cause now we can actually fix something. Darius dropped his hands, slowly. Fix what? Richard stood up, a calm determination settling over him. Everything, he said, and he meant it. But the next thing Richard told him would change his life in a way he never saw coming. Because this wasn't just about helping an employee anymore. It was about giving a young man a chance he'd earned 1,000 times over. Darius stared at Richard as if he hadn't heard him correctly. The idea that anything in his life could be fixed felt foreign, almost unreal. He wasn't someone who expected help. He barely expected understanding, so hearing the owner of the entire company say it so confidently left him frozen in place. Richard walked back to the prep table, the one cluttered with vegetables, towels, and a half-finished tray of celery. He rested his hands on the edge and took a breath before speaking. Darius, he said, I came here tonight looking for problems. I thought maybe the staff wasn't trained right or the managers weren't doing their jobs. I never expected to find someone carrying enough weight for 10 people. Darius let out a shaky breath. I don't want pity. This isn't pity, Richard replied. This is respect. Darius looked down, his shoulders tense, unsure if he could believe that. Richard continued. Do you know how many people would have walked away from your situation? How many would have said they were too young, too tired, too scared? You didn't walk away, you're here, you show up. You don't complain, you keep going, even when you shouldn't have to. He paused. That's not something I see every day. Lonnie's small hand slipped into her brother's and Darius glanced at her before whispering, I just want her to be okay. And she will be, Richard said. But not if you burn yourself out trying to do this alone, Darius swallowed. I don't have another choice. You do now, Richard stepped closer, voice steady, sincere. Here's what's going to happen, he said. Darius straightened, bracing himself, still expecting the worst. I'm giving you a raise, Richard said. A real one, enough to take some pressure off, enough so you don't have to work 12 or 13 hours just to keep the lights on. Darius blinked rapidly. A raise, not just that, Richard continued. I'm moving you into our internal development program. You'll get hands-on training, certification opportunities, and mentorship. You'll have a path toward becoming a full chef. Darius shook his head slowly. I can't afford school. You won't pay a cent, Richard said. We will. Darius just stared at him, unable to form words. And another thing, Richard said, we're arranging child care support, not someone taking her away. I mean after-school help, counseling access, and a safe place for her to go until you're off work. You shouldn't have to drag her to a kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning. Lonnie looked up, eyes wide. I won't have to stay in the cold room anymore. Richard's voice softened. Not ever again. Her face brightened. Small but real. Darius squeezed her hand. But that's only part of it, Richard said, turning back to him. Because I know what it's like to feel like everything rests on you. And I know how fast one small setback can knock everything down. He paused. So, I'm also giving you something else. Darius lifted his head slowly. What? A chance to breathe. Silence filled the room. Not heavy, but gentle. A kind of quiet that felt safe for once. You're not alone anymore, Richard said. Not on my watch. That was the moment the fight slipped out of Darius's shoulders. All the tension, the fear, the exhaustion. He let it go in a slow, unsteady breath. His eyes glistened, and he pressed his hand to his mouth to steady himself. I don't know what to say, he whispered. Say nothing, Richard replied. Just let us help. Darius shook his head in complete disbelief. People don't just do things like this. Not for people like me. Richard stepped closer. People like you, he echoed. Listen to me, Darius. You're not defined by where you started or what you didn't get a chance to finish. What matters is the kind of person you are, and everything I saw tonight tells me you're exactly the kind of person this company needs. A single tear slipped down Darius's cheek before he wiped it away quickly like he didn't want Lonnie to see, but she saw anyway. She wrapped both arms around him, hugging him tight. Richard let the moments sit, giving them space. When Darius finally looked back up, his voice was steadier. What about Mason? He asked quietly. He looked like he wanted to fire me himself. I'll handle Mason, Richard said. He's not the problem, and he's not your judge. Darius nodded slowly. Richard reached for his jacket. You two need to go home and rest. Tomorrow you meet with HR. I want everything set in motion immediately. Tomorrow? Darius asked. Yes, Richard said. This starts now. Lonnie hopped off the stool, rubbing her eyes. Can we get pancakes? She asked her brother. Darius laughed under his breath. Yeah, we can get pancakes. Richard smiled. That's a good plan. Darius helped her into her jacket, and as they prepared to leave, he looked back at Richard one more time. Thank you, he said, almost too soft to hear, for everything. Richard nodded. Just promise me one thing, anything. Don't give up on yourself. Darius gave a small, emotional smile. I won't. He put his arm around his sister and guided her through the kitchen door. Richard watched them disappear into the hallway. The past, young man who'd been carrying the world and the little girl who'd kept him fighting. The door clicked softly, shut behind them. Richard stood alone in the empty kitchen, surrounded by the late-night silence, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt hopeful. Change wasn't just possible. It had already begun. He looked down at the cutting board, still covered in slivers of pepper and celery, the kind of mess left behind when someone works past their limits with no help, no support, no rest. Well, he murmured to himself, not anymore. He turned off the lights, locked the door, and stepped outside into the night, letting the cool air hit his face. There are moments in life when you see someone fighting battles they never asked for, battles no one should face alone, and if you're lucky you get the chance to step in, a chance to stand beside them, a chance to change their story. Richard had taken that chance, and now it was Darius's turn to rise. When someone is drowning quietly, the right hand at the right moment can change everything. Sometimes people don't need judgment. They need someone to see them, someone to believe in them, someone to give them a chance they never got. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need hope today. And if you ever meet a person fighting silently, take a moment to listen. You never know how much your support might